As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I'll request that the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. We'll begin with an opening statement, and then I'll pass it to our ranking member for his opening statement. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing and thank our witnesses for joining us to discuss whether the Stafford Act and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA's, response, recovery, and mitigation programs that are designed to help our communities before, during, and following wildfire are working as they should be. While Southern Nevada, which is my district, downtown Las Vegas, doesn't have the same magnitude of risk for wildfire as elsewhere, the state certainly has similar experiences of those further north, our neighbors in California, Oregon, and Washington. All Western states have seen record-setting wildfires in recent years. Drought conditions have resulted in forests that are just ready to explode. That could be caused from a lightning bolt, a campfire spark, utility lines being interrupted by trees, or an arsonist match. We've seen all of those. As our witnesses note in their testimony, wildfire season now starts earlier and lasts longer, finishes later. Fires burn hotter, larger, and longer due to climate change. Fall storms, like those bringing welcome precipitation to the west just this week, arrive later, and they're less helpful in extinguishing still raging forest fires. We see that FEMA is providing an unprecedented number of fire management assistant grants to states in order to provide much needed federal assistance for fire suppression costs. While I'm sure our witnesses would rather not be experts in all things related to wildfires, they do represent states and communities that have been or currently are devastated by these destructive and sometimes deadly events. The subcommittee looks forward to hearing about their experiences, their successes, and their frustrations in responding to, recovering from, and mitigating against these firestorms. My hope is that today's hearing will provide a clearer picture as to whether FEMA's disaster and mitigation assistance programs are flexible enough to address the challenges currently faced by Western states. And I would mention that while the West's monstrous fire complexes have received the largest amount of media attention in recent years, forested states in the Southeast are also experiencing wildfires with increased frequency. What changes may be necessary to ensure that federal recovery programs, whether under FEMA or under HUD, meet the needs in the wake of these wildfires as they do for disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods. We want to be sure that we recognize the severity of wildfires and that we are dealing with them accordingly. So what does recovery look like 1, 2, or 5 years after a fire? How have survivors fared? Are housing needs being met in a timely way? Or are they just picking up and leaving like one-offs? Do they have access to, do individuals have access to crisis counseling and mental health after they've experienced such deadly and threatening events? The mental health situation is often ignored, but we know that it can have long-term impacts on both a community and an individual. And I'm proud to join our colleague, Representative Ayanna Presley, in introducing her Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act, which is bipartisan legislation that expands access to FEMA's crisis counseling program for all emergencies, not just those declared major disasters. A consistent thread across all of our FEMA-related oversight seems to be, and we hear it from all of you, burdensome bureaucracy and red tape. What might we cut with statutory changes that will make this situation better? What regulations or policies might FEMA need to revisit to be sure they're fully considering all of the post-fire needs? And are there any opportunities for a more united federal, state, local approach to recovery? The committee is scheduled to take up legislation tomorrow in a markup that will provide some additional relief for recipients of FMAGs, a bill to establish that 75% federal share is the minimum and that FEMA must work to establish criteria for when the federal share increases for fires of a certain magnitude. Additionally, in the Resilient America package introduced by Chair Fazio, Ranking Member Graves, Ranking Member Webster, and myself, there are provisions to boost resources for pre-disaster mitigation. And that includes providing assistance for communities interested in updating their building codes, establishing a pilot block grant program so states can assist residents in the wildfire urban interface, enhance defensible space around their property, and also installing fire-resistant building materials to reduce risk. So we've done a lot, but we have a lot to do, and we appreciate the advice and information from our expert witnesses. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to the discussion, and I now yield the floor to Ranking Member Webster.
Thank you, Chair Titus, and thank you for our witnesses who are here with us today. All-hazard approach to disasters is critical to ensure that preparedness and clear direction in responding to all the disasters there are. However, each type of disaster has its own peculiarities and challenges. Wildfires are no different. And unfortunately, wildfires have devastated communities across the states in recent years, and there have been lots to manage, lots to fight, lots to respond to. So it's critical for us to ensure FEMA, the government lead agency on disasters, is positioned to assist those communities to prepare for, mitigate against, and recover from wildfires. The most effective actions to prepare for or mitigate against wildfires may be very different than those actions needed for floods or hurricanes or the like. After a disaster, whether it's a wildfire or hurricane, we need FEMA to act effectively and efficiently to get assistance to affected communities without costly delay and mountains of paperwork. We must find ways to make sure FEMA works for the communities hit by the disaster, not against them. That's why I'm pleased we have witnesses here today who have experienced firsthand knowledge. They've got knowledge of what's needed and how FEMA programs can effectively support efforts to prepare and respond to wildfires. We may learn a thing or two, maybe, if we apply each of these things to other types of disasters as well. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses today, and thank you, Chair Titus. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. I would now recognize Mr. Defazio, Chairman of the T&I Committee, and Mr. Graves, Ranking Member, in that order, if they're present.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your holding this important hearing. In particular, I'd like to welcome Andrew Phelps, who is the Director of the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, joining us as a witness. He has been critical in a number of natural disasters that have impacted Oregon in recent years, including last year's wildfires, which were the worst of at least recent recorded history. 5,000 structures, 9 people lost their lives, tens of thousands evacuated, and it was extraordinary. And Oregon, working with FEMA, did for the most part a good job. There are some issues that we'll delve into a little bit here regarding housing, also the whole issue of and which has been raised by in the testimony I read about the problems of using HMGP funds for mitigation projects. I think there's a kind of a slant in FEMA over the years that they really kind of get used to dealing with hurricanes, floods, and wildfires were not so large or prevalent of an issue until very recently. And I think a lot of the bureaucracy hasn't quite adjusted to that. And I mean, in particular, mitigation prevention, but also mitigation after I was reading something about how there's problems where there's no categorical exclusion for for these recovery projects, and you have to get I read in one of the testimonies, take up to 2 years to talk about putting in native plants and doing other things to prevent landslides afterwards and begin to recover. So I think there's a good deal of work needs to be done here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the witnesses also, along with Chair Titus and Ranking Member Graves and Webster. We raised questions earlier this year with FEMA regarding denial rates, and there's different reasons. I know we're going to protect against fraud. I get that, totally get that. But the process shouldn't be so difficult for people to get the individual assistance they need. And the documentation sometimes when, for instance, in Puerto Rico, you had to finally waive some of the documentation requirements because the courthouses were gone. So people couldn't prove that, that was their property or they'd lived there for so long, and started accepting some self-attestation. And we have similar problems when it comes to the mobile home parks, I think, which several of which were burned during the fire disasters in Oregon. So anyway, I look forward to hearing all the testimony and hopefully looking at ways we can just make a few changes in the way FEMA does things. Generally, I am very appreciative of the agency and its work, but I think we need a little adjustment when it comes to wildfires, wildfire mitigation, prevention, and recovery. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is Ranking Member Graves with us? No. I guess not, so we'll go ahead and hear from our witnesses. I'd like to introduce them and welcome them. Mr. Andrew Phelps, you've already had introduced by Chairman Defazio, but he is the Director of the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, and he's here on behalf of National Emergency Management Association. Ms. Casey Casey, who is a state forester and fire warden in Nevada's Division of Forestry. Mr. Rich Elliott, Deputy Chief, Titus Valley Fire and Rescue on behalf of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and Ms. Casey Hatcher, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer at Butte County Administration. So thank you all for being here. We look forward to hearing your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the committee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So now we'll proceed with our witnesses. Mr. Phelps.
Thank you so much, Chairman Defazio, for the introduction, Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Webster, and distinguished members of the committee for allowing me to testify today. I am proud to provide testimony on behalf of NEMA, the National Emergency Management Association, representing the state emergency management directors of all 50 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. The phrase spreading like wildfire is no longer just an idiom. It's becoming an all too frequent reality for emergency managers, first responders, and the communities we serve as the threat of wildfire continues to expand beyond Western states, with devastating fires impacting our friends in the southeastern US and along the East Coast. Managing the impacts from wildland fire is challenging and unique, given high percentage of federal land in Western states and the checkerboard of land ownership. Many wildland fires originate on federal lands before impacting local communities. As a result, what begins as a federal incident often leads to costs to state and local governments. Unfortunately, federal disaster response and recovery assistance has been delivered through the lens of floods and hurricanes. Unlike those hazards, wildfires are no-notice events, can burn for months, and often combine with one another to create large, complex incidents. We saw this repeatedly in Oregon last year. The 2020 firestorm was a worst-case fire scenario come to life for us in Oregon, as we fought fires while also battling a global pandemic. Oregon's wildfire activity steadily increased over the past decade, with more fires burning hotter in areas that historically haven't burned, and with fire season becoming a 12-month event. The September 2020 fires, however, were unlike anything we'd ever seen. Over the span of 2 days, dozens of new fires ignited as what could be considered hurricane force winds whipped across our state, rapidly driving existing fires past containment lines, overwhelming already strained resource and response systems, and torching homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure in dozens of communities across Oregon. My heart breaks for those who lost so much, and especially the 9 Oregonians who lost their lives. Now, 14 months after the fires, we find strength and hope as we continue to heal, grieve, and recover. Nearly every destroyed home site has been cleared of hazardous materials and other debris left behind by the flames. Hundreds of new homes are being built as long-term recovery groups help survivors access necessary resources to help them write their own recovery stories. Through partnerships with federal and state agencies, philanthropic and nonprofit organizations, and the private sector and local governments, neighborhoods, cities, and natural spaces are showing signs of recovery. Oregon and her people and communities are strong. Our experience in Oregon, however, highlights the need for changes in how we as a nation apply existing emergency programs and structures at the federal level to these disasters. Now, this hearing is slightly ahead of the ongoing policy review process with my colleagues at NEMA, but I can give you a sense of the issues we're examining to determine recommendations. FEMA should be the lead coordinating agency for all incidents requiring federal assistance to ensure coordination and continuity between disaster response and recovery. They must exercise leadership to ensure programs such as public and individual assistance adequately address the wildfire threat. They should update incident period and declaration criteria and include post-fire emergency work as eligible under PA. The pre-deployment of equipment through Fire Management Assistance Grants, or FMAGs, is currently limited to out-of-state resources. We should utilize this grant for pre-staging of firefighting resources within the state to prevent fires from reaching more severe levels of destruction. FEMA policies for mitigation programs currently limit mitigation activities on federal land. Unfortunately, it is often the impacts of fires on federal land that lead directly to the need for additional firefighting and mitigation on state and private land. Creativity will be required to ensure mitigation programs can assist in managing these events holistically. I also want to acknowledge our partners from FEMA who have been assisting us in Oregon throughout our wildfire recovery. Many of the innovative solutions to challenges we've experienced should be memorialized in policy because disasters, after all, are policy issues. They're a result of how we build, where we build, and the investments we choose or do not choose to make. Extreme weather, prolonged drought, and the devastating fires we've experienced in Oregon are not anomalies or outliers. They are indicators of what is to come. We must ensure federal programs can adequately support state and local governments in response and recovery efforts and properly evolve with this threat. We at NEMA look forward to working with you in addressing these challenges. And once testimony is concluded, I'm happy to take any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phelps. We appreciate that. Our next witness is from the state of Nevada. We're delighted she's here. Ms. Casey first joined Nevada Division of Forestry in 2002 and has served as state forester since April 2017. Ms. Casey has more than 15 years of professional experience in forest management and natural resource conservation, including her tenure as Nevada Department of Forestry Deputy Administrator and as the Program Manager of Nevada's Sagebrush Ecosystem Program. She holds a degree in Forestry Research and Conservation from the University of Montana. She's a native of Gardnerville, Nevada, and she's the first state forester to head Nevada's Division of Forestry. Congratulations on that. Welcome to the hearing, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Webster, and members of the committee. Again, my name is Casey, State Forester Fire Warden for the Nevada Division of Forestry. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and submit my written testimony as the subcommittee examines FEMA's Wildfire Assistance Program. Climate change conditions, dangerous fuel accumulations, and increased development in the wildland-urban interface have caused significant increases in catastrophic loss of life, property, and ecosystems across the United States, but as you've also heard this morning, most dramatically in the Western United States. These changes have increased burdens on insurance companies and national programs like those managed by FEMA to assist with the increase in the costs of not only wildfire suppression, but the losses suffered to homes and business owners. Oh. Sorry, I lost my spot here for a second. In the last 21 years, Nevada has burned close to 10 million acres, which averages to just over 470,000 acres per year. This is more than double the previous 20-year period in Nevada. Of note, within this 21-year period, Nevada has burned close to or over 1 million acres annually in 6 different years, which in the previous 20 years, there was only 1 year, which was an anomaly in that 20-year period. The increase in fire frequency and intensity is requiring more active ecosystem management to prevent catastrophic loss prior to wildfires starting. In 2020, NDF, along with our federal and local government partners, treated over 182,000 acres, which was a 48% increase from 2019, despite challenges related to the pandemic and workforce issues. This year, we collectively treated over 257,000 acres so far, which is for the first time ever, probably more than we've burned in the state this year so far. Nevada Division of Forestry is designated as the governor's authorized representative for the application of fire management assistance grants, or FMAGs, in Nevada. FEMA's FMAG program is critical, and we very much appreciate the support for state and local and tribal governments because of the 75% reimbursement rate afforded to those partners for non-federal wildfire suppression costs. NDF applies for FMAGs on behalf of all local government fire departments under contract in the state of Nevada, which equates to 98% of the fire departments within the state. FMAG eligibility is based on 3 primary criteria: threats to human lives and property, availability of state and local government firefighting resources, high fire danger conditions, and the potential for major economic impact. Although population size for threatened communities is not explicitly identified in FEMA's guidance to states on FMAG applications, it appears to be widely used when determining eligibility. This has continuously ruled out many of Nevada's largest and most affected areas for wildfire loss, which is our rural areas, who do suffer severe economic loss to landowners, to rural economies, to agricultural enterprises, mines, tourisms, and local and state governments. In 2018, FEMA allocated Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, funds for wildfire mitigation to those FMAG communities. Since 2016, NDF has been awarded 17 FMAGs and subsequently over $10.7 million in HMGP funds to those communities. Of the 10.7 million, close to 8 million has been awarded for wildfire mitigation projects, yet none of those funds have been implemented on the ground due to a lengthy application and environmental review process. The funds that were allocated for equipment purchases have been executed and completed. A portion of these HMGP funds are needed for emergency stabilization measures immediately to ensure that there is no further loss to lives and properties due to flooding or landslides following rain or snow events after wildfires. FEMA should create a program to advance the necessary portion of these HMGP funds to recipients immediately upon approval so that emergency stabilization measures can be put in place. With lengthy delays of funding availability, we find ourselves in a much more costly and time-consuming restoration project due to ongoing erosion, sedimentation, and invasion of non-native fuels. FEMA programs for floods and earthquake mitigation are very well established with pre-calculated benefits and average costs for certain projects to expedite review and approval. A similar project should be developed for wildfire emergency stabilization measures and mitigation projects for wildfires to streamline the process and ensure that the actions can hit the ground immediately. Thank you for allowing me time to speak on this issue. Following testimony, I too will be available for questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Casey. We'll now go to Mr. Elliott.
Good morning, Chair Titus, Ranking Member Websters, and members of the subcommittee. I am Deputy Fire Chief Rich Elliott with Kittitas Valley Fire and Rescue, which is in Central Washington State. Today, I am representing the International Association of Fire Chiefs as the chair of the Wildland Policy Committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. The wildland fire problem is a national problem. Every state in the union faces the threat of wildfires burning through their communities. We must take comprehensive action to address this problem. It will require cooperation between federal, state, tribal, territorial, and local governments, as well as the private sector and the general public. FEMA programs can be used to address this wildland fire problem. They can fund mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery activities. Most importantly, they bring stakeholders together to plan and cooperate before the fire occurs. One example, FEMA's BRIC program, which is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, is an opportunity to engage everyone to mitigate the cost of wildland fires. BRIC grants can promote the use of building codes, such as the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, and fire-resistant materials to reduce fire damage. They also can fund the removal of hazardous fuels and protect community lifelines. However, we must also use these grants to build capacity for mitigation projects. Local jurisdictions require technical assistance to educate the public about the importance of activities like prescribed fire. Also, we need help in navigating the environmental reviews and the litigation that are part of the mitigation process. The nation must also develop an experienced workforce to handle a surge in mitigation projects. Due to budget shortfalls and COVID-19, fire departments across the nation are facing staffing shortages and challenges procuring equipment. An example would be the semiconductor shortage, which is delaying the delivery of brush trucks to fight wildland fires. Many fire departments must train their firefighters to respond to wildland fires. Volunteer fire departments are facing problems recruiting and retaining personnel due to COVID-19 restrictions. Even career and combination fire departments are unable to induct recruit classes at a rate they require. FEMA's grants, the Fire Safer EMPG programs, can help with these challenges. Fire and Safer provide matching grants directly to local fire departments for training, equipment, and staffing. The EMPG program can be used for planning for the response to wildfires. And I thank you for the support of these programs. The FMAG program mentioned before is a tool for funding the response to major wildland fires. It brings together federal, state, tribal, territorial, and local authorities to work in a collaborative manner. However, there is room for improvement. We recommend that the committee consider the Wildfire Recovery Act, HR 1066. This bill would allow FEMA to set thresholds for raising the federal match for FMAGs. This would help communities devastated by wildfires to recover faster. We also asked that FEMA use the FMAG to fund the full footprint of the wildfire, regardless of whether it crosses jurisdictional boundaries. This will promote cross-border cooperation during wildland fires. FEMA can also take steps to improve mutual aid response. The reimbursement process can take years to resolve between FEMA and the states. The local fire department can be left holding the bill. FEMA could make the reimbursement process more transparent so that the local fire department can determine when they will be reimbursed. In addition, FEMA could standardize the reimbursement costs of common resources like volunteer firefighters. FEMA could also adopt tools that complement the EMAC system. For example, the National Mutual Aid System makes it easier for fire chiefs to identify and request the closest resources during a wildland fire. This program can support both intra and interstate mutual aid. The IFC urges FEMA to promote community preparedness efforts like Ready, Set, Go, which promote local preparedness and planning. They educate homeowners about how to protect their property and safely evacuate when necessary. I thank this committee for its leadership in creating the HMGP post-fire program. This allows affected areas to prevent flooding after fires and create erosion barriers, reseeding, and other activities. After a fire, FEMA could provide additional technical assistance to help communities recover and rebuild. In some cases, latitude may be required so that a fire station could be rebuilt in a safer location. As I conclude, I emphasize the importance of action. In 2020, we had 59,000 fires burned across more than 10.1 million acres. The federal cost alone has increased from $240 million in 1985 to $2.3 billion in 2020. Without aggressive action, we can expect to see the severity of these fires increase as well as the cost of lives and property. The IFC stands as a partner to local and state agencies, and I will be available for questions after.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Our last witness is Ms. Hatcher, and I understand Mr. LaMalfa would like to introduce Ms. Hatcher. Be recognized, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Titus, we're delighted to have today with us Casey Hatcher, who have the opportunity to speak with us today about the various issues she's run into as the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Butte County in my district in Northern California. She joined Butte County in 2011 as a member of the Economic Development Unit, has worked in some shape or form on disaster recovery since 2008 California wildfires. So including the county's Emergency Operations Center and the fires that affected, the disasters, that affected Butte County since the 2017 Oroville Dam spillway incident, the 2017 wildfire, Ponderosa Fire, LaPorte Fire, and Cherokee fires, the 2018 Camp Fire, the 2020 North Complex Fire, and most recently, the million-acre 2021 Dixie Fire. She has a wealth of knowledge about these wildfires and their response needs and how they impact county governments. I know she's eager to speak with all of us about this today, and she's been a delight to work with as an effective in helping the recovery for all these disasters that we face in Northern California. I appreciate her insight today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa. Ms. Hatcher, you can go ahead.
Good morning, Chair Titus and Ranking Member Webster and members of the subcommittee, and thank you, Congressman LaMalfa, for the introduction. I appreciate your time today. As Deputy Chief Administrative Officer, as Congressman LaMalfa mentioned, I serve as the Camp Fire Recovery Director for Butte County. Butte is a suburban county in Northern California with just under 210,000 residents. We are located west of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and a significant portion of our county is in areas at risk for wildfires. As Congressman LaMalfa mentioned, we are no stranger to disasters. In just the last 5 years, we've experienced 12 disasters. 7 have federal declarations. This includes the 2018 Camp Fire, the most deadly and destructive wildfire in California history. Our county knows that FEMA assistance is critical for local governments when recovering from disasters. We simply could not do it alone. But it appears that the Stafford Act and FEMA are designed more to serve areas prone to disasters like hurricanes, storms, and floods than wildfires. But as the severity and frequency of wildfires increases, the Stafford Act and FEMA must change to better address these types of disasters. I'll walk through a few examples today that highlight what we've seen in recent wildfires in our county. Housing is critical after a wildfire. Homes are destroyed, and then residents cannot live back in the burn area until debris removal is complete. Butte County lost 14% of its housing stock in the 2018 Camp Fire. FEMA approved direct housing assistance, but it took 9 months before an official FEMA housing group site was ready with manufactured housing units. In the meantime, fire survivors lived in hotels, tents, trailers, slept in parks, or moved from place to place. So much time lapsed that many people waiting for FEMA housing moved from the area and resettled permanently. FEMA tried to place housing units back on individual properties, which could have been a little faster, but by its own requirements, no one could live temporarily on the property until the toxic debris was removed, which took about a year. Additionally, the units didn't meet the building code to be placed in the wildland urban interface. You've talked about this as the WUI, because they didn't meet fire standards. This also prevented the 600 plus manufactured housing units that ultimately ended up in the FEMA group sites from being sold to fire survivors as permanent housing solutions. It appears the housing units FEMA has are most often used in areas after storms and floods. And when we asked about getting WUI compliant units, we were told they simply didn't have any in the system. Moving on to debris removal, this is a critical step after a wildfire because it literally clears the way for rebuilding. Butte County advocated for almost a year for a debris removal program for burnt hazardous trees. The program was ultimately approved. It included trees that could fall into the roadway and harm the public, but not trees that pose an increased risk to become fuel for future fires. Standing burnt trees can make future fires worse and should be eligible for debris removal. A unique factor of wildfires is they often burn on national forest land. However, Forest Service land cannot be included in debris removal programs funded by FEMA, and sometimes the Forest Service is uninterested or unable to remove the debris or trees on its own. This leaves burnt, hazardous trees along the roadway as fuel for future fires. This happened in the Camp Fire. This happened in the 2020 North Complex fire in Butte County, but it will be a more significant issue for the 2021 fires, like the Caldor Fire that burned near Lake Tahoe in California. Debris removal efforts after fires in our county put hundreds of heavily loaded trucks on roads not constructed for that type of traffic. FEMA was reluctant to approve permanent work for road repairs and wanted to shift those costs to the contractors who performed debris removal or to the private utility companies that had been in the area restoring services after the fire. This really left Butte County fighting for assistance to repair crumbled roads. After the 2020 North Complex fires, we estimate $35 million is needed to pay the local share of costs for road repairs and repairs that were denied by FEMA. And that is on top of $47 million in unmet road repair needs after the 2018 Camp Fire, just 2 years earlier. This is more than our typical annual road budget in total. Local governments lack adequate funds for infrastructure normally and cannot stretch those local funds to repair roads after a major disaster. I highlighted a few examples for you today, but there are many more in the written testimony, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the subcommittee. Thank you for your time, and thank you for considering the topic today and your focus on emergency management.
Thank you, Ms. Hatcher. Though this testimony has been very helpful. We'll now move on to members' questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing the full committee chair, Mr. Defazio.
Thanks, Madam Chair. There's a pattern here, and particularly, first raised by Andrew Phelps about how FEMA really looks at these disasters, as he says, through the lens of hurricanes and floods, but it could be properly adjusted to meet the ever-growing wildfire threat with some modest adjustments. And that's a theme. We heard about housing units that weren't fireproof, et cetera, et cetera. So if everybody could come up with like 1 or 2 things that you think, and state it briefly, that should be changed, that would orient FEMA more toward fire recovery and mitigation pre-fire, that'd be helpful to me. I'm trying to there's so many acronyms. This agency must have more acronyms than any other agency in the federal government. So I have no idea how to keep up with them, but if you can be specific, that'd be great. Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus, Chairman Defazio. Let's call out maybe some of the references in the PAPA-G, another acronym, the Public Assistance Policy Guidance. I would recommend a quick change, or a really impactful change would be how we view hazard trees. By FEMA's definition, hazard trees are those that have a split trunk, broken canopy, or are leaning at an angle of over 30 degrees. That's not the kind of damage you see to trees in wildfires. Very often wildfire trees look perfectly healthy on the outside, and take a skilled arborist to make that determination as to whether or not a tree can survive for months or years after a fire. Looking at how we handle private property debris or commercial debris removal, what constitutes a damaged concrete slab. There are some nuances that we find after a fire burns through an area that cause damage that may be repairable after a hurricane, or maybe more obvious after a hurricane or a flood, but just needs much greater consideration following a wildfire.
Okay, Casey, do you have some thoughts on this? So
yes.
You're nodding your head.
Thank you. I think the first one that pops up for me, this was a great discussion. I think one of the big ones is working with experts. It requires that local government, state government, federal government, all of us work together, emergency managers, state forestry agencies, restoration and reparation after fires. In communities, it looks very similar to other issues, other floods and other disasters in some ways it doesn't. And so we need to set the standards to make sure that wildfire criteria are looked at, those things that happen after fires. But when you're looking at ecosystems too, we have to timely remove those trees if we're going to get any funding or get any money back from say, the timber that could be sold. We've got to have markets to sell that timber. The current rate of wildfire destruction in the Western United States, we don't have a market for the timber that's coming off for normal projects, let alone the mega fires and gigafires or whatever they're calling them today that we're seeing. And so we need to work together to look at all the criteria on how all these funds would be applied for wildfire mitigation and pre-calculated benefits so that we can get this money out there quickly to the ground.
Okay. Anybody else want to volunteer on this?
Yeah, this is Rich Elliott on behalf of the IFC. I would say the reimbursement process, we view the IFC members and local governments as a surge capacity working with the states and the federal partners on medium-sized incidents. And if we can do this correctly, a lot of times we can keep those smaller, medium-sized incidents from becoming these large complex fires with multi-million-dollar price tags attached to them. And whether it's through the en masse process or just transparency or just a guarantee that, hey, this is when the payments will come out, it would make the local governments a little bit more willing to sort of lean forward and help the neighbors, and overall the suppression costs would be reduced. So thank you.
Great. Ms. Hatcher?
Thank you, Chair Defazio, for the question. I concur with everything that was mentioned by the other witnesses and would just add that it's important to focus on the people affected by wildfires and displaced by these large disasters that are now occurring, and a focus on housing and looking at the eligibility of people who can receive housing, which I mentioned in my written testimony, and the type of housing units and their way they're deployed. It's very difficult, unlike areas affected by floods and storms. It's very difficult to deploy large housing sites in wildfire areas, particularly close to burn scars. So a focus on housing, I think, is really critical.
Yeah, I saw that in your county, they brought in these units that cost $325,000 each. I don't know, they must have been pretty nice, but they didn't have the proper siding or any kind of fireproofing, right?
I think it's just not typical that they're deployed for wildfires. I think they are used to floods and hurricanes and storms. And so what was so unfortunate is they couldn't be placed inside the burn scar. So they couldn't go back on lots as temporary housing to be there for any number of fire seasons, and then they couldn't be placed there permanently. I think that seems like a pretty simple fix potentially. Understanding the diversity in states for building codes and the ability to make them hardier against wildfires if that's where they're going to be placed, either temporary or permanently.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're going to have to follow up on. The committee will need to follow up with the leadership at FEMA in terms of developing units that are suitable for areas that are fire prone versus flood or hurricane prone, very different kinds of needs. And I just, the price tag seems to me a bit exorbitant, knowing people who make very nice manufactured homes in Oregon. And I think we need to delve into that too. That's seems very high, and particularly for one that isn't suitable for replacement in that area. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate your suggestions and look forward to working with you on that. With that, I yield back to balance my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize Mr. Webster, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Chair Titus. Deputy Hatcher, you highlight challenges of FEMA's deadlines for submitting for reimbursement and so forth. We have run into that in hurricanes too. We've had some problems with the timeline being too short or sometimes being too long, and things happening that in the occurrence of those events that actually, in some cases, flooding. The flood doesn't come until maybe 30 days after the event because the water is building. So anyway, how does that impact your ability to respond to recovery activities and balance that with paperwork?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Webster. I suspect this is not just a problem for wildfires, but as you mentioned, in a state like yours is also an issue with storms, floods, and hurricanes. The unique factor that wildfires have is that the length of the fire can be prolonged, and then the area can be evacuated for a significant period of time. After the campfire, the area was evacuated for over a month before people could even go back to view properties, get in to have FEMA do inspections, have their insurance companies do inspections. So the timeline for those types of disasters can be quite different. I think the Papa G, as Mr. Phelps mentioned, the guidelines that FEMA follows to operationalize these programs should take into consideration the uniqueness of the disaster when establishing the administrative timelines, essentially, for submitting for reimbursement. And we had a very short timeline after the 2020 North Complex fire. Luckily, we were a bit of a well-oiled machine because we had just done it for the 2018 Camp Fire. Otherwise, we simply would not have been able to meet that timeline and would have compromised local reimbursement. We have a lot of experience, unfortunately, but I'm thinking of other rural communities who might experience a wildfire and not be prepared with administrative staff or that type of opportunity to meet those deadlines. So I think FEMA really needs to look at them more on a disaster by disaster basis.
Okay, so do you think it should be like a more flexible time frame that's permitted under each of these scenarios, ones you talked about, the one I talked about?
Yes, I think that while they want to put in place a standard, not every disaster is the same. So something more flexible would help local communities respond.
You also mentioned in your testimony about heavy equipment, trucks, I think, and other things to move things out of the way or whatever needs to be done. But the roads that are there aren't designed to take the heavy load. Give a little bit more about what complicates that when you go for reimbursement and so forth, when maybe somebody's trying to charge you for those damages.
When a fire burns through an area, it can often scorch the pavement and damage the road, and those repairs need to be made. But what often exacerbates the damage to the roads is the emergency response and then the recovery associated with debris removal from structures, debris removal from trees, restoration of utilities in the area, the firefight. There's a lot of damage on these local roads that really are not intended for rated for that type of truck traffic. And we saw this really significantly in the 2020 North Complex fire, where FEMA pushed back significantly on those road repairs. They wanted to shift that responsibility elsewhere. And the county simply doesn't have a mechanism to collect those funds from other places for road repairs. FEMA's public assistance funding is designed for this permanent type of work for road repairs. And we found ourselves really in a constant battle with FEMA over this issue. And, you kind of are left in this adversarial relationship with FEMA that feels like they don't understand the community, and that maybe you're going to be left with generational damages to your roads because there simply aren't local funds to fix them.
Yes, so were they trying to charge you, or were they trying to charge maybe a contractor that was hired to do some of that heavy equipment movement of materials and so forth? What was going on?
That's right. They indicated that we should have it in the contracts with the debris removal contractors that they should restore the roads. But that was not included in the contracts the state had with the contractors, and there was really no mechanism for them to repair the roads. That's not a situation we've ever seen before. Perhaps that has worked in other disasters, but not any that we've heard of. So they were trying to essentially transfer the responsibility with no real ability to do it, which essentially means that the road doesn't get repaired.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Norton, recognize Ms. Norton? I'll go back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Mr. Phelps of the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. Mr. Phelps, disaster survivors have found that the so-called IHP, Individuals and Households Program application, which is FEMA's primary program for home repair, property displacement, and rental assistance. They found this application to be overwhelming and even confusing. This process is especially inaccessible to low-income individuals and those who live in mobile homes or on land they do not own. What recommendation would you propose for streamlining the IHP application process and ensuring that low-income survivors can obtain access to disaster relief?
Thank you for that, Representative. As we've heard a little bit this morning, disaster recovery, it really needs to be survivor-centric. FEMA's made some improvements based on lessons they've observed on our wildfire disasters. They've lowered some of the barriers to proving residency or home ownership documentation, going down as far as self-attestation. That's a great step in the right direction. But we need to step away from this notion that when we're trying to offer assistance to survivors, the first thing we're trying to do is prevent fraud. The second thing we're trying to do is prevent an IG investigation. And then the third thing we're trying to do is help survivors. Survivors and helping survivors needs to be at the front end of every decision that's being made. One of the other successes that we had here in Oregon was a re-engagement with disaster survivors. Those folks that received a denial letter early on, several months later, FEMA came back and met with those folks and said, okay, what were the barriers? Why were you denied? And what can we provide in terms of assistance to help you navigate these processes? That resulted in many millions of dollars that disaster survivors in Oregon were entitled to being paid out that wouldn't have otherwise been paid out had they not done that re-engagement. So this second bite at the apple, as it were, for disaster survivors is important, but we need to ensure that FEMA is proactively leaning forward, working with the states and local communities to provide that assistance. Anything that we can do to lower barriers to assistance must be done. There are many federal programs that offer various assistance to folks during disasters, during blue sky days. We should do an audit of all of those programs, see what those lowest barriers are to assistance, and apply those to disaster scenarios, because this is a time when folks can least afford to navigate complex bureaucracies and when they need the help the most.
Thank you. Ms. Casey, your testimony notes that FEMA eligibility will vary for the same community from year to year, even though the community is experiencing the same threats to human lives and property. Could you describe the impact to your state's emergency management planning as a result of a fluctuation in FEMA eligibility?
Thank you for the question, Mrs. Norton. This is Casey again. Yeah, it tends to vary. I'm not sure. We look at the criteria for what an FMAG, a qualifying FMAG experience. I'm sure that there are limited funds, obviously all of us. And when we are competing with, let's say, California or Oregon in 2019, in those years where there is devastation and large fires everywhere with a lot of homes and properties being threatened and or lost, that might be part of the reason, but that upfront would help us to understand when we're applying. This particular instance we're talking about is a community within Nevada that has been impacted by wildfire and evacuated for wildfire 3 of the last 5 years, and has seen loss to both homes and structures and infrastructure in the community. I think it's really critically important. Chairwoman Titus brought it up earlier that we remember too, when we're looking at the increase to these fires across the state, there are huge impacts to the mental health of the people who are continuously being evacuated. This is the 3rd time those folks have been evacuated, and this continues to impact them in different ways. So we need to look at how this is applied, because again, going back to the FMAG for the payment the whole purpose of an FMAG in general is to help assist local government and state government response to these fires. It's critical. The states and local governments don't have the funding for the increased fires across our lands. And we do have to ensure that we have the closest available resources available to fire, regardless of the patch or the type of fire department we work for. So I think those things are critical, and maybe just understanding right up front, the criteria are out there for FMAG applications, but when they're in times of crunch or there's a high need for the FMAG, what are they then looking at to rank the states and the projects that are being applied for?
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chief Elliott, I don't know if you know, but I was a former fire chief for the city of Miami. So we're both firefighters. And I know that the best way to deal with fires is to prevent them, right? Not even have them. So, I know that FEMA has issues with reimbursement and the housing stock and all that, and other people are going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about how to prevent these devastating forest fires. And so, fire needs three things. It needs an ignition source, it needs oxygen, and it needs fuel. The ignition source, sometimes we can control it, sometimes we can't. Oxygen, it's in the air, nothing you can do about that, but the fuel you can do something about. Are there some restrictions on the ability, and this also could be answered by Ms. Casey, on the ability to manage forests and the fuel load of those forests so that once a fire actually starts, the severity of those fires can be diminished? Are there some restrictions on your ability to do that?
Absolutely, and some of them have been referenced both directly and indirectly. The ability to sort of process the biomass on our public and private lands doesn't exist in a lot of communities, and I would defer. I've been down to the state of Florida and the state of Georgia and watched they have very active land management programs, and their forests are generally healthy and somewhat resistant to very complex and damaging fires. You come up to the Northwest, where you think there would be forests, and we don't do the job that we should be doing. And I think that's true in a lot of communities in a lot of states, that for a lot of different reasons, probably from a whole bunch of different perspectives, we've degraded our ability to sort of manage the lands in a way that is healthy for the next generation, and that leads to clogged fuels, whether it's prescribed fire, whether it's some grazing, appropriate logging, those type of things. A lot of those activities have been curtailed or made very difficult, and therefore the land is sort of ripe for a very catastrophic fire that does a lot.
So would you say that that's a lack of resources, money, or is it regulations that kind of tie your hands?
In my experience, it's a combination of both of those. Yes, the regulations make it difficult, and maybe are driving the fact that there isn't infrastructure in terms of private industry and a business to sort of process those products coming off the land. And so I think it's probably a combination of both of those, and we need to look holistically at the sort of the health of it's not only the forest, it's the grasslands, it's the shrub steppe. We've done some things wrong for 110 years, very well intentioned, and we probably need to change the narrative a little bit over the next couple of decades.
Fair enough. And so I think that, would it be fair to say that if we actually invested more money in prevention, we could be saving a heck of a lot of money in after the fact mitigation and all the monies that we have to spend after the big forest fire? Is that fair to say? That's not an accurate statement?
I think it's preparedness, mitigation, and prevention all end up saving you money on the backside. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. In relation to what you said about Florida, Georgia, et cetera, I know that in Florida we had over 1 million acres of controlled burns, the last year, and yet in the entire state of California, I think they had maybe 30,000. And the forests in California, a heck of a lot bigger than and a lot more area than the ones in Florida. We learned our lesson from the big fires that we had about 10, 15 years ago. And so we manage our wild, areas, our forests, I think a heck of a lot better. And so I think as a government, I would like to see us more focused in on regulations and also the way to actually manage the forest a lot better, and then we can prevent these large fires. Ms. Casey, would you say that that's accurate? That's an accurate statement, or do you have a difference of opinion?
Thank you for the question. No, I think that's a very accurate statement. That's why I did highlight the fact that we are working very closely together, state, federal, local government. In our state, we've created a shared stewardship agreement under the governor of the state of Nevada to bring together all state, local government, federal agencies who have land management responsibilities to one, we do have limited resources, limited funding. And so we have to prioritize our projects in the highest risk areas. And so we are looking at those areas. We've identified 13 in the state of Nevada, are actively working in all of them to address that risk. And just to give an example, this is a California fire example, but the Caldor fire that came through Lake Tahoe, we have been working collaboratively in the Lake Tahoe Basin for decades. We learned early on that jurisdictional patches didn't matter when fires came through, nor when bugs and insect and disease come through. So we had to look at mitigation and suppression the same way. So we implemented a tactic like the mutual aid tactic spoken of earlier for fire suppression, for mitigating fuels in the basin. And when you saw that fire come through the Tahoe Basin, we had no single loss of structure, not any in that basin. It wasn't by chance. It was because of the 89,000 acres we had treated collectively in high risk areas that gave firefighters a safe place to defend those homes from. And so I think that is so critical, making sure that we're working together, addressing those highest risk areas, and making sure that all of the management actions we're taking are collaborative and really have an impact on what's happening on the ground.
Thank you so much. My time is up and I'll yield back, but I hope to be working with both of you to develop some legislation too for mitigation purposes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And now recognize Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hatcher, you state that the trauma from wildfires can be exacerbated and care FEMA's immediate disaster case management and the disaster case management program. FEMA's crisis counseling assistance and training program play a role in this disaster, especially in mental health. Is that true?
There is significant trauma that is experienced by wildfire survivors. And that, I think, is somewhat unique, although to be fair, I don't want to take anything away from other disasters because they often can occur quickly. Evacuations have to happen immediately, and there can be the trauma of a very hurried evacuation followed by the loss of your house and all of your things. And the disaster case management we found after the 2018 campfire just simply wasn't adequate to address the needs from a time perspective and the scope of the services for fire survivors.
Thank you very much. Well, that involves also the housing. The temporary housing was inadequate because it was built for floods and hurricanes. Maybe we could find the less costly and better built in the future. And also, I'm concerned about the fact that they don't expedite the funds. Is there an issue with the paperwork or with the turnaround time that you're faced with, anybody?
I can speak to that. We did receive some expedited funds after the campfire because it was such a large incident, and the amount of paperwork associated with just that expedited claim activity is so substantial that we have had to bring on additional staff just to help with those claims. I want to be fair to FEMA and recognize the need to follow the Stafford Act and to meet the policy guidelines, but it feels like there's lots of opportunity to reduce the burden on local governments who are so strapped for resources when responding from wildfires.
Would you be kind enough to recommend some of those comments to us in the committee so we can benefit from them, ma'am? It would be greatly appreciated. But it seems like we're not gearing for climate change for any of the agencies. The paperwork for citizens, how do they know what to apply for? If they're turned down, do they know they can apply for the next batch? Or how long it takes between them? Would somebody be able to answer that?
This is Andrew from Oregon, Representative Napolitano. Happy to speak to that issue. Navigating the complex web of federal programs, assistance programs, after you've lost everything, your home, your job, and in some case, family members, does nothing to alleviate the trauma that folks have experienced during a disaster. I applaud FEMA's efforts to assist with disaster case management, finding ways to match folks in the community, getting multicultural, multilingual folks out in the community to serve as caseworkers and help folks navigate these complex problems. Those are all steps in the right direction. But again, we need to make sure that we're erring on the side of helping survivors. Does fraud exist? It does exist. We've got documentation of that here in Oregon from our disasters. But when someone has been living in a hotel or a motel or in their car for weeks and weeks and weeks after they've lost their home in a fire, it's pretty easy to determine that those folks are not trying to commit fraud. They're just trying to rebuild their lives. So anything that we can do to lessen the burden, provide that real almost social work case management approach to disaster survivors, and understand that folks need to be met where they are after a disaster. I'm fortunate. If I was impacted by a disaster, I could take a week off of work and work through the process. A lot of folks aren't in that position, and we need to make sure that those that are most marginalized and disadvantaged in our communities are the ones that get the most assistance.
Especially the ones that are less income and minorities. For all the witnesses, the GAO has stated that FEMA's individual and household program is not meeting the needs of low-income renters and homeowners post-wildfire. In your experience, what has been the most pressing obstacle and aid to these populations so that we can try to address that sooner rather than later?
This is Casey Hatcher, and I would echo what Mr. Phelps had to say about needing to focus on the fire survivor first and not the assumption of fraud or worrying about an audit. I think this is what really prevents us from individually assisting each person through their scenario. We could reduce the barriers for eligibility for that individual assistance and look to help people with their individual scenario. Maybe they were multiple families living in a household together and are having trouble proving residency. Maybe they simply want assistance to live temporarily outside of the county while they figure out their rebuild. Maybe they need mental health resources. But we saw after the 2018 Camp Fire that the case management assistance that came forward and the mental health assistance just wasn't enough to address the magnitude of the need from our fire survivors.
Thank you very much. Provide any of those comments to the committee, please. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I got one question and I want to yield to Mr. Lamalfa. My question will be to Mr. Phelps. And when we manage some different things from FEMA, one of the issues is the what types of categorical exclusions must be helpful in your case. You highlight how the environmental and historic preservation reviews can be a cumbersome and the challenge with the lack of categorical exclusions that can help speed up the process. If you can point out what specifically you're saying about this.
Thank you, Representative. I would say when we look at something like the EHP requirements, the environmental and historical preservation requirements, very often when we're looking at things like emergency protective measures, the process of going back and recreating whether or not considerations were made for environmental and historical preservation as we're trying to stop a wall of flames from moving into a county, destroying thousands of homes and taking lives. I think that's an unrealistic expectation. So we need to be a little bit more flexible, understand the dynamic nature of wildfires in particular, and exercise that flexibility to ensure that when our firefighters are out there working in the heat, the smoke for days on end, they're doing the best they can to both be good environmental stewards, but also save lives, protect the property, and also do what they can to protect the environment. Going back and trying to recreate some of that documentation after the fact is overly cumbersome and places a greater liability and strain on resources that are already tapped to save lives and property.
Thank you, Mr. Phelps. I want to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you, my colleague from Puerto Rico. I appreciate the time and also working with you previously on dealing with Puerto Rico's disasters and hurricanes. So I hope things are improving for you there as well. Thank you. I'll be speaking with Casey Hatcher here a little bit from my home county of Butte. Obviously, we've faced a lot in the last few years in Northern California and in Butte County, dating to the spillway disaster and at Oroville Dam that's been rebuilt well now. And I want to say right up front too that FEMA's response has been very good by and large with what we've tried to accomplish in all these disasters and working with the state, with Cal OES, and just trying to break through what would have been normal, the bureaucracy that might happen. We got some pretty rapid response on that, but as Casey lined out here, there's things that maybe are unnecessarily still bureaucratic in nature that we need to work through. And just to get quicker response, get people back in homes and things like that, or the FEMA trailers. And I do share Chairman Defazio's concern that if these units are really costing $325,000 for a portable building like that, I would envision being 90 to 120, 140. I don't know why something has to cost so much, just because government is the one involved purchasing it. So we need to take a closer look at that. But Ms. Hatcher, would you elaborate a little bit on the costs of repeated disasters? You talked about the roadways. Right here over my shoulder this was actually the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I believe it was. Highway 70, just across from Butte County and Plumas County. I guess Butte County's off the hook on that one, so to speak. But this is just an example of post-fire with the amount of erosion. And we talked about this in our previous hearing with Chief Randy Moore, can we do things to get on the post-fire erosion and dangers we have there? Anyway, Ms. Hatcher, please elaborate on the disaster post-fire costs and the challenges the county faces on roads. We had that with Oroville Dam and others.
Thank you, Congressman Lamalfa. That picture is a really great example of exactly what happened. That's in a burn scar, and that slide is what can happen after a fire disaster. And when you are a small county like we are, and you have a fire followed by a slide and a flood followed by a fire, there is so much impact and that strains your local resources to be able to respond, that we would like to see changes to the level of assistance that is provided to communities that have consecutive disasters in some period of time, because there is an inability to pay that local share of costs again and again to address these varied types of disasters. After a wildfire, the land needs time to restore itself and becomes more susceptible to slides and floods and things of that nature. And you can see that type of consecutive disaster happen.
Yeah, as I noted that your parents are in the U.S. Forest Service and we know that land doesn't restore itself. We got to get back out and do the work on that for restoration for all these hundreds of thousands of acres. So
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, and
Lamar.
I yield
We'll
back
come back to
my
you
time.
when it's your turn. Now it's Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might like to start here with asking for unanimous consent to enter into a record a recent article in the Washington Post by Hannah Dieter about the Erickson family who lost their home in the Camp Fire. So I'd like to have that entered into the record.
Without objection.
The article speaks about the human element of the disaster and the long process that this particular family, and unfortunately it's not a unique situation, but it's one in which it exemplifies the complexity and the difficulty that occurs after a disaster such as the Camp Fire. We're going to have to figure this out. The questions that have been asked and the answers that have been given are all most appropriate and begin to point out the nature of the problem. Part of the problem is it's by the book. And several of us have talked about maybe there ought to be a few efforts to move beyond the book, the rules and the regulations and flexibility there of those rules and regulations. The second issue really goes to one of the long-term housing needs, and that's been discussed here in some detail about the time it takes to be able to return to a community that's been burned out. The other has to do with the housing itself, which is an ongoing problem for the state of California. But I'd like to go to Deputy Chief Hatcher, if I could. Do you think the answer is for FEMA to develop a mobile home park? Or what would be, or what other alternatives are there? What would be the best solution in your mind in a case such as camp, or say half of a camp situation?
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi, for the question. We would like to see FEMA have solutions for temporary to permanent housing that addresses the needs of those with the fewest resources. You mentioned the Ericksons, which they were the last family left in FEMA's group housing site after the Camp Fire. And I want to be clear that FEMA assisted many, many households, and we're incredibly thankful for the assistance that comes from the federal government. But there has to be a solution that looks to permanent help for folks as opposed to just a temporary solution, because we lost 14% of our housing stock and less than 10% of that has been rebuilt nearly 3 years after the Camp Fire. And there is just simply not an opportunity for those with few resources to quickly recover after a wildfire like this because of the prolonged nature of recovery.
Well, we've discussed the nature of the temporary housing being built in such a way as to meet current codes in California. That's one thing that may be able to deal with this. The other is the necessity for holistic support, and that's been discussed in different ways here. The role of the state of California is critical in this, because most of the support systems are either funded by or directed by the state that the county should carry out one or another of those programs. So I'm really looking here for any one of you, and perhaps Casey, you seem to be the go-to person here, and perhaps Mr. Phelps, how can we develop a solution in which all of the resources that exist, from healthcare to social services to homeless programs of one sort or another, how can all of those be focused for the benefit of those individuals, such as the Ericksons and others who have been, whose homes have been destroyed in one or another of these disasters?
I would say that we need to have a coordinated approach. There are a whole variety of agencies that bring resources to bear after a wildfire, and they're often very beneficial resources, but sometimes can lack coordination. And you're right that there's assistance coming from the state of California and from the federal government. And I mentioned earlier the disaster case management, and we would really like to see the case managers from FEMA better coordinate with those that are in the local community from community-based organizations to really set individuals on their own path to recovery. It can be incredibly difficult to navigate all of the resources available after a disaster, and that could be a really key piece. It maybe is not within the purview of this committee, but other resources that come for housing assistance, like community development block grant funding for disaster recovery that's overseen by HUD, is kind of divorced from coordinating with FEMA. And those pieces need to tie together better.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. There's a lot more to be said here about this issue of coordination. I would point out that there's a major housing element in the reconciliation bill that we hope to get out of here soon. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Back to Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Again, we find a lot of parallel concerns here with, what Mr. Garamendi was saying as well on the housing situation. I think, and we also have to step back a little bit and really ask the question, is it FEMA's long-term mission to be so far into housing? We had to work to get them to approve temporary housing for up to 2 years following Camp Fire for the folks like down in Gridley, et cetera. And but is it really the proper role? So bringing up, we have to look at a mechanism, maybe a smoother handoff to HUD longer term that would be for those folks that are, underinsured or not insured that get burned out. We're talking in the Camp Fire, Paradise, and others around Magalia, Yankee Hill, Concal, and then also the situation we had where we lost most of the town of Greenville up in Plumas County, and next door to that, Canyon Dam. And then we have a situation where over in Lassen County, the town of Doyle. So you have all these issues that are going to be long-term situations, and since FEMA is an emergency management agency, we need to, forge together a mechanism for a better handoff. So FEMA is going to have to keep responding to other disasters, whether it's going to be the many fires that we're going to face in the future, and hurricanes, and who knows, earthquakes, whatever you're going to have in this country. So, and that's not to take away from FEMA, it's not take away from need. I don't want to downplay that at all. The need is going to be very great until we, on the wildfire side, do much, much better at forest management and buffers we need around these communities. So coming back to you again, Casey Hatcher, since we have two Caseys, let me talk about quickly the Beckworth fire versus the Dixie fire. Beckworth happened just before the Dixie fire, farther up north and east in California, basically about 10 days before Dixie. Ironically, as I was returning from being up there with the folks at the Beckworth fire, I saw the Dixie fire had started just a couple hours before I came down the Feather River Canyon on 70. And there was fire folks on the scene already, but who knew at that moment that that was going to turn in months later to nearly 1 million acres. In this case here, what we see is Greenville in Plumas County versus Doyle up in Lassen County. You have two different types of disaster. One group of survivors basically is going to get assistance and one will not. So in what we're talking about, when the lava fire and salt fire in Shasta and Siskiyou counties, you have, they're overstretched from disaster up there as well. So you have issues where if those fires had happened closer together in time, that they would have been more eligible to make FEMA be able to draw all the fires into one big disaster, I guess. So we have the situation, it has to cause a bigger threshold of disaster to have them become eligible for it. So you have to have more damage to unlock federal assistance. So if you could tie them together, or unfortunately, nobody wants a bigger number. So, Casey, I guess, given the record-setting fire scenes we've seen in 3 of the past 4 years, we're looking at with Butte County, but we know about your neighboring counties too. Are we at the point where we're going to have to keep needing more and more resources to help fight these fires and begin the long-term recovery? What are we looking at? Just it's pretty discouraging.
It does seem to be that the frequency and intensity is going up. And you mentioned a situation that we had in 2017. We had 2 fires in the summer that didn't qualify for a major disaster declaration from the federal government, and one that happened to be part of the fires that happened in the North Bay in 2017 that did, because it got grouped with it. And they received resources and benefits that similarly sized fires in our community didn't. But it's the consecutive nature of the disasters and the ability for the local government to operationalize assistance that really is at play. When you look at Plumas County, which is where I grew up, it's so small, and the resources that they need to help Greenville are significant because of the size and the need of their county. And those types of circumstances and the consecutive nature of the disasters need to be considered when we're taking a look at what type of assistance is provided to communities, because We are seeing an increasing need for this recovery, and as was mentioned earlier, an increasing need to mitigate these types of disasters.
Thank you. Appreciate it. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A recent article in the Washington Post titled "The Last Day Inside Trailer 83" detailed the last few days of a family living in the Chico housing site. This article described the difficulties that many wildfire survivors have finding permanent housing after disaster. It also describes how all the rules and requirements in our disaster recovery program actually affect people's everyday lives. This story stuck with me because I saw how difficult it was for the people in Louisiana after Katrina to get permanent housing. 16 years later, we find ourselves with the same situation with Ida. I also worry about the means for constituents of Louisiana 2nd District who survived Ida. What this article showed me was that no matter what specific act of nature, whether it's a wildfire, heat wave, a freezing spell, an earthquake, or a hurricane, those of us who face any natural disaster face many of the same challenges afterwards. Mr. Phelps, any lessons learned that can be applicable to hurricanes moving forward from the wildfires and the experiences that you found yourself in?
Thank you for that, Representative Carter. And first, happy birthday. I believe birthday wishes are in order for you today, sir.
Thank you very much.
We talk a lot about the federal assistance and the federal family that comes to support you after a disaster. We've heard a little bit already about HUD and some of the community disaster block grants that are available. That funding needs to come sooner. We haven't yet received CDBG DR funding through HUD. We need to ensure that FEMA is in lockstep with their partners in HUD. I would recommend that they look at the model that we've adopted here in Oregon. Days after the fires began, we established a work group with emergency management, our Oregon Department of Human Services, which was responsible for mass care and the immediate sheltering needs, and the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department, which handles housing across the state. And we began charting out what our path would look like for permanent housing for disaster survivors. You don't have that same kind of relationship, I don't think, between FEMA and HUD. To see more engagement, interaction between those agencies earlier on in a disaster, it avoids even the need for a handoff, which was discussed earlier. These two agencies then are working in sync from the beginning to identify long-term permanent housing solutions as opposed to a stage gate process where folks are moving from temporary shelter to intermediate housing to long-term housing. The sooner we can get folks out of hotels, motels, or shelters and into permanent housing, the better off our survivors and the economic viability of our communities are going to be. So that would be one recommendation, ensure much closer connectivity between FEMA and HUD early on in a disaster when we know that hundreds or thousands of homes have been lost.
Any thoughts on how we can use the experiences that you guys have had to establish paths to permanent housing?
I think a lot of that is lowering some of the barriers to accessing federal assistance that we've talked about already this morning. That's included in my written testimony. Ensuring that we've got case managers who understand the complexities or the lack of affordable housing in communities and can work in partnership with community-based organizations to think creatively and be innovative in how we're siting affordable homes. We keep putting these folks that have lost homes back into hazard zones, whether it's moving them out of the wildland-urban interface and into floodplains. That's got to stop. We're just kicking the can down the road to the next disaster, and we're putting our most vulnerable at risk.
And I think the Washington Post story really zeroes in on the personal side, human effect of how this affects people when it becomes a matter of adding insult to injury. We know that when people go through these horrific natural disasters, they find themselves in a place where they never could have imagined they would be. And then add further insult to injury when they seek help from federal agencies. They're treated very indifferently in often cases where people are made to have onerous requirements to prove who they are, what they lost. We know that fraud is a real case, but we should do things to make it easier, more accessible for people to get resources than to be treated like criminals when trying to get resources. What do you think about truncating or lessening the requirements to get these resources to people?
It's an absolute critical piece of this puzzle. Again, I think FEMA's made great strides in the last couple of months by changing their individual assistance policy to reduce the barriers that folks have to show to prove home ownership or residency. We need to see that applied across other programs as well as folks try to access federal assistance.
Thank you. Watch you back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Now, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chief Elliott, in your report that was issued prior to your testimony on page 3, you talk about FEMA's role in mitigating wildland fires. You say FEMA's mitigation programs can play an important role in helping communities prevent damage from wildland fires. You talk about things such as prescribed burns or removing hazardous fuels. You also reference the BRIC program, the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities program, and how that has the opportunity to mitigate natural hazards. And you go on to say that BRIC grants have supported programs to reduce the biomass and hazardous fuels in the WUI and use it for electricity generation. It sounds to me what you're referring to there is generally just forest management, ways in which we can manage the forest so that we can better prevent wildfires before those fires begin. The old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so I would ask if you would, could you expand, Chief, on the BRIC program and particularly expand on the use of things such as prescribed burns and where you talk about the reduction of biomass and being able to use that to generate electricity?
Yes, sir, and thank you for the opportunity. So what we're looking at from sort of a local perspective is developing an infrastructure that makes the federal government's and FEMA's efforts sustainable over the long term. Removing fuel or active land management or active forest management is an ongoing process. And so from our perspective, we see the key to this as developing technologies in industries and in some cases reinstalling industries in communities so that we can process that biomass, to some extent make that an economic contributor and take that liability and turn it into an asset. And yes, this is entirely about active land management. And when we talk about programs like the BRIC program, really this goes back to the cohesive strategy, which two of the elements there are resilient, fire-resistant landscapes and fire-adapted communities. And we have to accept the fact that there is a fire interval on most of our lands in this country. In other words, there's a cycle of fire that's going to come back. And the longer we put that off through, artificial suppression, the more damaging that catastrophic fire is going to be when those weather conditions or the fuel conditions are bad. So the mitigation and the prevention efforts are absolutely where we believe we should be focusing, because that's going to create for our grandkids a less of an issue with wildland fire in the United States. We can't turn this around in a year. We're doing what we can for the recovery and the suppression, but we need to get ahead of this problem. And that's going to be through active land management, mitigation, and prevention.
And these forest management programs, is it your opinion that, one, it would create a healthier forest, and then ultimately that in the long run, as this program continues to play out, that we would have less damage, less destruction because of the wildfires that are regularly occurring?
Absolutely. All of those things done correctly will produce a more resilient ecosystem, more resilient landscape that we can use. And we also believe that, especially in many communities, that this can redevelop industries or create new technologies where those industries actually contribute to the local communities as well. That this isn't something we keep going back to the federal government for fuels mitigation.
And when you talk about fuels mitigation, when you talk about reduction of biomass, would that include things such as thinning forest land and things of that nature? If you would just kind of explain in a little more detail when you're talking about those two categories, more specifically, what are you referring to?
Yes, appropriate, and all of the caveat here is appropriate, appropriate logging, whether that be commercial or just thinning projects, whether that be chipping projects. Prescribed fire is absolutely part of the solution. And we also look at the reintroduction of grazing in certain lands. Again, all of this balanced against done in the context of, what's correct and what will actually contribute towards long-term forest health. And again, we're talking about grasslands and shrub steppe as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm out of time. Now you're back.
Thank you. Now we recognize Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses that are here today participating in our hearing. Ms. Hatcher, in 2020, California experienced its worst fire season on record as fires burned across the entire state. 2021 is again proving that fire season is becoming year-round, with over 2 million acres burned throughout California. In my district, we just had the LaSalle fire breakout a few days ago on October 11th. Thankfully, it is now 97% contained, and I want to extend my thanks and gratitude to all the firefighters and first responders that helped in this effort. While a lot of the focus centers around getting fires under control, other important aspects are pre-fire deployment of resources and post-fire response. From your experience in county government, how can FEMA better support counties in their post-fire response? And after meeting with first responders, many have raised the issue of the need to pre-deploy resources ahead of fire-prone conditions. However, this places a cost burden on local governments. What has been your experience in Butte County?
Thank you, Representative, for the question, and I'm so glad to hear the fire is becoming contained in your community. The post-fire resources, the need is significant after a wildfire, from everything to the cleanup to the housing to, as has been mentioned here, mental health services and disaster case management support. I think one of the things that FEMA could really do, not just right after a disaster, but on an ongoing basis, is to provide technical assistance and help local governments to build capacity. We had, before the Camp Fire, one person in our Office of Emergency Management locally. And we grew that capacity to be able to respond after the Camp Fire and the 2020 North Complex fire, but many rural and suburban communities simply don't have those types of capacities. And I would recommend that there's a lot of technical assistance even before a disaster strikes that can be provided to local governments. You also mentioned the staging of resources, and we've seen this be an issue both before wildfires as well as other events, storms, floods, things of this nature. I think the flexibility of FEMA's mitigation assistance to recognize the type of need, whether it's the clearing of fuels to prevent disasters, or whether it's the staging of resources to help to protect life when there is a disaster. They have pretty strict mitigation requirements that don't recognize some of those other types of community lifelines that are in need.
Thank you. Ms. Casey, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 included a significant enhancement to FMAG assistance, authorizing post-disaster hazard mitigation grant program assistance to help local communities recover. However, as I have experienced this firsthand in my district, there is an abundance of red tape that has made these federal dollars hard to access in many cases. While my office was ultimately successful in working with FEMA to ensure that over $13 million in federal dollars were awarded to the Santa Barbara County Flood Control District to help build a debris basin, the delays experienced were clearly unacceptable. how can FEMA be a better partner in helping alleviate the burden on local governments to be able to access these resources and funds?
Thank you for the question, Representative Carbajal. I think you've heard a lot of the same, so I'm going to repeat what's been said, maybe in a different way, maybe in the same way. I think a lot of it is pre-planning and working together ahead of these disasters. We experienced and are experiencing the same delays. We're very thankful for those HMGP funds and the amount of funding that is flowing through FEMA to help us recover from a rehabilitation and revegetation side from wildfires in the state of Nevada. But we're also experiencing those delays. And I think part of that is the upfront planning with partners, not just looking at the state, through our emergency management, our all hazard mitigation plan, but state forestry agencies, local governments. We have plans for resource management. We know kind of ahead of time where fires, we can't predict where human cause starts will happen, but we do kind of know where fires are going to have the greatest impact in our state because we look at historical data. We know where we're really dense in our forests. So we need to look at those areas and work collectively. We're very good at working together, land management agencies, emergency management agencies, health departments. It's probably time for us to expand that reach in the beginning, to work together to make sure that we are prepared and we know what plans are out there. And then FEMA could utilize those plans that have been vetted by partners and worked collaboratively to create for implementation, to expedite implementation.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. I have one question for anybody on the panel. We heard you say that we need to put the fire survivor first. Well, we know from previous experience with evacuations, whether it's a hurricane or earthquake, that many times people won't evacuate if they can't take their animals with them, their pets. And nobody has mentioned pets or wildlife or livestock. How does this fit into FEMA's recovery plans? Or even the
Chair
housing
Titus.
problem?
Chair Titus, you're absolutely correct that many times people will not evacuate unless they can take their animals. And in Butte County, we offer large and small animal shelters. And recently our ag commissioner has developed a program that allows people back into the evacuated areas to feed commercial livestock in order to help promote the evacuation of these areas so that first responder personnel can focus on fighting the wildfire instead of evacuating individuals. We are very pleased that FEMA reimburses this type of assistance, and we think that they can better help facilitate this by helping to share these types of best practices across communities where they are being effective. It is a challenge as shelters start to close and there aren't rental housing units or permanent housing units for people to go with pets. It's a challenge for getting people to move from shelters or temporary housing assistance, though, and that is an area where we could work with FEMA to develop some best practices.
I think that would be great. We would appreciate that. Can you tell us how it works in Nevada, Ms. Casey?
Yes, thank you for the question, Chair Titus. It's very similar. We work with our emergency management agencies, our public health officials. So the response is very similar from an evacuation of people, their pets, their livestock. There's a lot of people that come together to ensure that things get moved into the right areas. One of the things that I would say up front is when we talk about the three tiers, the active land management, building those resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, so that's the construction in and around, and then making sure that we have the proper suppression assets, that's the cohesive strategy. That's how we're going to address this. Some of FEMA's programs do address these issues. There are lots of other programs in the federal government that also address those. And so coordination and amongst those programs and who is the right party to take on those responsibilities, we need to make sure that that's part of our consideration as we're moving into these disasters. And just coordinating and planning ahead, you wouldn't think about this necessarily, but a lot of the fires that have been discussed today that happened in California had significant impacts into the state of Nevada, both from evacuees that came into the state of Nevada and have moved here permanently. So our housing market has been affected. We've been building more and more houses into the wildland-urban interface, trying to create affordable housing where people can live. And so we are just kind of increasing our risk here. So that coordination needs to happen not only within the state and amongst the state and federal local government agencies, but also across state lines where we're going to have impacts.
Well, one of the themes we've heard throughout the morning is this need for kind of an all-of-government approach. One group that's also involved when businesses are effective is the Small Business Administration. So when we are looking at who we need to coordinate with and who needs to be at the table, and as we try to revise some of these provisions y'all have suggested, we want to be sure that that's the case and we don't leave anybody out. I would argue that you also need to have some environmentalists at the table, because that's where you're going to hear some of the opposition to some of the more extreme forest management issues, where it comes to endangered species, et cetera. Anybody want to comment on that?
This is Rich Elliott. Yes, we've been working, to try and create some level of balance, because obviously, the rules that exist today exist for reasons. And so we need to take a, more balanced approach when we talk about active land management, and make sure that what we're doing to the land actually contributes to the long-term health of that ecosystem. If we compare that, with an economic benefit to the community in terms of, specific kinds of logging, grazing, those types of things, that's an added benefit. But obviously this has to be about sort of restoring balance to our ecosystem across the U.S. And what we're seeing is maybe it's weather patterns, but we certainly have a drought in the West, but our ecosystems are stressed. And when they're stressed, even if it's a traditionally more wet area, it only takes a few degrees over a few years or a few percentage points in RH, and suddenly something will burn when it wouldn't normally burn. And those are the kinds of realities that we're facing. And absolutely, this needs to be a very balanced approach, but it needs to, there's probably going to need to be some compromise kind of on both sides. No logging, no grazing is not been a good policy. Putting out every fire, has not been a good policy over the last 110 years. And we need to shift a little bit. And probably developing in certain areas hasn't been a good, national policy, that, we create risk in areas that we know are going to burn catastrophically just due to their topography and their vegetation, regardless of what kind of land management we do.
Well, thank you, Chief. As we wind up this morning, I've heard some themes repeated throughout all the questions and the answers. We need more coordination and cooperation, an all-of-government approach. We need flexibility. One size doesn't fit all among the programs and the relief. We need to review the needs and perhaps expand what services are available, and that includes everything from mental health to paying highway repair. We need mitigation and prevention, not just recovery efforts. And we need to do this quickly, because the situation is getting worse and it's becoming an existential issue. So I thank all of you for your testimony. That we really appreciate it. Mr. Webster, anything you want to add?
I just say you summed it up well. All these things are more expansive than we would ever think. So floods more than just water. It's all kinds of things. And same with hurricanes, fires, and so forth. So thank you for this hearing. It's really been great.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Also, I'd ask unanimous consent to insert into the hearing record a statement from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Without objection. And is there another one you said?
Western Governors Association.
And also, I'd like unanimous consent to insert into the hearing record a statement from the National Western Governors Association. That would include our Governor Sisolak. Well, that will conclude our hearing. I hope that these excellent witnesses will stay available to us and provide us with your wise counsel as we try to address some of these issues. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted now in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by the members or the witnesses so they can be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. We now stand adjourned.